Hello, everyone. Hello. It's great to see you all. Would you please stand and join us as we sing?
Good morning. Welcome to Heritage. I'm Pastor Paulk, and I'm so glad you're here. If this is your first time here, we'd like to invite you to meet us after service in the Hub, which is just off these back doors and to the left. The Hub is the place to be if you want to find out more information about Heritage or learn how we can serve your family. We would love to meet you. So there's a song we sang a few weeks ago for the first time together in this room called Same God. And if you were with us that day, you'll remember how that song pointed us to this simple truth, that the same God we're inviting into worship this morning is the same God who called David to fight a giant, who parted the seas for Moses, who gave courage to Esther and discernment to Deborah, and who rescued Daniel from the lions. So as we enter into our worship this morning, I want to invite us to remember that the God we're welcoming into our lives and into this moment now is the same God who protected and guided and called the heroes of our faith. And that's my prayer for us this morning, that we would always remember how big and mighty and enduring our God is and that he's not done. Let's stand and sing.
Control what to Test 1, 2. That's my fault. It is so good to be with you this morning, and so good to be a part of a church that loves to help other people, sometimes total strangers. I saw this week that the death toll in the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria has eclipsed 50,000 people. And while that's incredibly heartbreaking and there's more heartbreak still unfolding, I'm so thankful to be a part of a church family that wants to help with that. I'm so thankful for my friend Andy Johnson, who has missionary contacts in that part of the world, who called me almost immediately after we found out that news and said, I have avenues by which Heritage can help. And so we were able to start taking a collection to give aid in Jesus' name in Turkey and Syria, and there's still opportunity to give to those causes through our online giving portals and all of that. But it's meaningful. It touches your heart when you think about all of the ways that in emergency, in crisis, in tragedy, people come together to help somebody else. And I came across a story 2 weeks ago that it's 23 years old, and I'd never heard it before, and I wanted to tell it to you. It's a story about helping people in crisis. In fact, it happened in the aftermath of the attacks on September 11th. You can imagine, or some of you can remember, that there was lots and lots of offers of help coming in from all over the world, and there was aid coming, and there were prayers coming, and there were people that wanted to help and send money and give blood and all the other ways that help was pouring in to the United States. But there was a young man who was from Kenya, who was in New York, and after all of that happened, he traveled home. And he told the people in his home country, in fact, he was part of a tribe called the Maasai people. And he told them about what had happened. He was telling them the whole story. He had been in New York. He had seen some of the events unfold firsthand. And all of the people that he was talking to said, we need to help. We need to do something to try to be helpful. What can we do? And they put their heads together and they thought the most valuable thing that we have is our cattle. And so what they did is they called the U.S. Embassy there in Kenya, and you can look this up on the State Department website. This is a real story. They called and got an ambassador to come out, a diplomat of some kind to come out, and they did a ceremony where they donated 14 cows to the United States of America, which was a beautiful, touching thing. And the diplomat, they gave that a really appropriate pomp and circumstance and all of the reverence that it deserved, but transporting those cows back to the United States was going to be a big project and probably more expensive than, was worth doing. And so they came up with a plan. They were going to ask the Maasai herdsmen to be the caretakers of these United States cattle, and the profits, the proceeds that came from that little herd would go as an act of goodwill in return to help with educational scholarship money for Maasai children. And it's a beautiful story, and I love the story, but there's kind of underlying understanding, especially for those of us that live in Texas like we do, that we didn't really need 14 cows, right? We didn't need 14 cows, but they needed to give it. It was important for their hearts, just like all of the other countries and individuals and corporations, just like all of the other families that did something to render aid to the U.S. in that time of need. It was important for them to give. And the thing is, you and I are here this morning to give to God. Now, we're going to do an offering moment, a generosity moment that we do every week, and that's part of what I'm talking about. But we're also giving to God time, attention, energy, focus, songs, prayers, fellowship. We're giving to God all morning, right? And the thing is, you got to understand, God doesn't need any of that. There's not anything that God was missing this morning. God didn't wake up this morning and wonder where he put something, you know. There's nothing that God needs from us. In fact, God even said so. And he talked about it, talking about cows. I want to read to you a short passage from Psalm chapter 50. God says, I do not need the bulls from your barns or the goats from your pens, for all the animals of the forest are mine, and I own the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird on the mountains, and all the animals of the field are mine. If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you, for all the world is mine and everything in it. Do I eat the meat of bulls? Do I drink the blood of goats? Rhetorically, we know the answer is no. Here's what God really wants. God says, make thankfulness your sacrifice to God, and keep the vows you made to the Most High, and then call on me when you are in trouble. Remember, God just said, if I was in trouble, if I was hungry, I wouldn't call you. God says, call me when you're in trouble, and I will rescue you. So the whole deal is that as we show up here today and we participate in all of these giving efforts, everything from our time, attention, money, energy, songs, prayers, all of that we're giving to God, you got to understand, it's not because God needed it. It's because of how important it is for our hearts to give it. It's because of how important it is for us to realize who we are and who God is, and the gap between the two, the gap that God has closed. This is why we do it. It's why we participate financially in the mission and ministry of the church. It's why we give our time and attention. It's why we show up here early on a Sunday morning. It's why we do all of this. It's not because God needs it. It's because we need to give it. And so I want you to know you're invited to this moment of generosity with us, not out of any kind of expectation or obligation, but out of invitation. Because it'll be good for your heart. It'll be good for your heart to say, God, you don't need this, but I need you to have it. So let's worship in song together as we practice the gift of generosity together as well. Would you stand?
You give life, you are love, you bring light.
Boy, I love when we sing together the song that we just sang. That song about, God, it's your breath in our lungs that makes life possible. It's your breath. You own it. It's your breath that's giving us the opportunity to even sing to you. When we remind ourselves that it's God's goodness and God's generosity that makes it possible for us to when we remind ourselves of that, boy, that puts things in some perspective, doesn't it? I mean, it's a song of praise, it's a song of gratitude, but it is a song about perspective. Yesterday, I got the opportunity for a few minutes to visit with a ministry friend of mine that I've been friends with for 25 years. But 2 years ago, he was hospitalized for 2 months and intubated twice with COVID, and it was touch and go the whole time. It was amazing that he survived the ordeal, but you'd better believe that now, when he sings, God, it's your breath in our lungs, he sings that with a different perspective than he used to sing it, right? I mean, he sings that from a different place, and perspective is so valuable because when you get good perspective, then you start to be able to see things for how they really, truly are. When you start to recognize that you depend on God for every one of these, then you get some perspective about your own fragility, right? When you start to recognize how faithful God has been with the millions of breaths that you've already taken, then you start to get some perspective about how precious you must be in the eyes of the Creator. And so I'm so glad you're here, and I'm so glad that we are here gaining perspective and paying attention to God together. I couldn't help but laugh this week at a story that I saw on the news. Maybe you saw it too. It's a story about an increasingly famous French bulldog named Ralphie. And Ralphie lives in Niagara Falls, New York, at the SPCA Animal Shelter again. And Ralphie is making a name for himself nationwide as being maybe the most impossible dog to live with. Nobody can seem to adopt Ralphie and keep him. The SPCA there in Niagara, New York, has been using their social media accounts to search far and wide. They're looking way beyond the borders of their own city to try to find a suitable owner for Ralphie, but they are, at the same time, they're not trying to sugarcoat his temperament. They've been posting videos that demonstrate some of the oddities of Ralphie's personality. They've been posting descriptions about Ralphie's behavior, and some of the things they've said are things like this: we don't actually have too many nice things to say about Ralphie. Now, y'all, this is the SPCA. They've got something nice to say about every animal, right? Not Ralphie. We don't actually have too many nice things to say about Ralphie. He is 100% full jerk. And while we have used humor to help make his behaviors more palatable for public consumption and social media, his behaviors are no joke, according to the SPCA. See, the problem, though, is that French bulldogs are cute, and they're a breed that's in high demand. And so when the uninitiated, unaware, uneducated just adopter walks into the SPCA there in Niagara, New York, and they see, oh, it's our lucky day, there's a French bulldog here, they feel like they have struck gold. And so lots of potential adopters are drawn to Ralphie when they first see him in the shelter. And the problem is that Ralphie has a mean and destructive side that has so far rendered him unadoptable, unmanageable. In fact, over the course of the last month, he has been adopted and returned to the shelter 3 different times, with each adopter deciding after a few days that Ralphie is just not going to be a fit. for our family. Because sometimes you find yourself in one of those situations where it's just more than you bargained for, right? Sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you bit off more than you could chew. It's more than you could handle. And sometimes you might even feel that way about your spiritual life. Sometimes you might think to yourself, this spiritual journey I'm on, the experiences that I'm having with God, this may be more than I can handle. And some of you know that since the beginning of the year, we've been working our way here at Heritage through a series of messages that's taken from a prominent part of one of Jesus' most famous teachings, all right? There's a big sermon in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, the first book in the New Testament portion of your Bible. But at the beginning of that sermon, the introduction to that sermon, there's a short section that we call the Beatitudes. It's found in Matthew chapter 5, and the Beatitudes are just comprised of a series of statements of blessing. Statements where Jesus is explaining and revealing the nature of how blessing works in the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus keeps pronouncing blessings on various groups of people, but the odd thing that we've noticed along the way is that he keeps choosing to bless or to pronounce blessing toward people that usually aren't thought of as blessed. He blesses groups like the poor in spirit, or people who are merciful, or people who are mourning. And honestly, if those people are blessed, it almost has to be because of some kind of divine intervention, right? Because the world doesn't treat those people as blessed. If you're too merciful, you get run over, not blessed. If you're sad all the time, you get left alone, not blessed. But this is exactly Jesus' point. What we keep coming back to is that Jesus is trying to tell us that there has been a divine intervention. The kingdom of heaven has come near, which is the message that Jesus spends the book of Matthew trying to preach. And when the kingdom of heaven has come near, then people who were discouraged suddenly have a reason to be encouraged. This is Jesus' message in the Beatitudes. When God's kingdom comes to earth, there is now good news for people who are accustomed to bad news. And I need you to remember who Jesus is talking to. When Jesus shared this message, he's speaking to crowds of people who have come out from the nearby cities out into the spaces between town. They've come out from the nearby cities in order to hear him teach, and many of them to try to experience or witness him performing a healing miracle, all right? Which tells us a few things about the audience. It tells us that either many of them don't have jobs, or they've taken the day off and they're not getting paid today, and they don't live in a part of the world where many people can afford to do that. And so many of these people have come out and they know what suffering is like. In addition to that, many of these people are either themselves sick or injured or disabled, or they've brought a loved one who is sick or injured or disabled, and they're hoping that Jesus might be able to help. And so these are a group of people who are very familiar with real suffering, and not just in the distant past. I'm talking about like they woke up this morning and they remembered that this is a world that's full of suffering. These are the people that are listening to Jesus' message on that day, in addition to his newly commissioned disciples, all right? The people who he had recently called to be his followers. And the blessing statement that we're going to read today, in fact, it's the last of all of the Beatitudes. We've worked our way through the entire series at this point. The blessing statement we read today is in Matthew chapter 5, verse 10, and it sounds like this. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." And we've gotten into the habit of reading these twice because they're so short, so let me read it again. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Persecuted because of righteousness. You know, I think it's a hard life lesson that everybody eventually has to learn, that sometimes you will be mistreated for doing the right thing, right? Maybe you've experienced this yourself, but it's just a truth that sometimes even when you do the right thing, you can get the wrong response. You can get the response that you weren't hoping to get. It does happen. I found an old story, a 30-year-old story that came out of the Bosnian War of all places. And some of you can remember this war in the early part of the 90s that was happening in Eastern Europe. And this is a story about a family of Bosnian Serbs, okay? So these are the Protestant Christian portion of the population over there who are part of the fighting that's going on. And this family's adult son had been taken away for questioning by one of the other factions. It happened to be a Muslim faction, and their son had never been returned. In fact, they assumed that their son had been killed. And 5 months after their son was taken, their son's daughter was born. Okay? So there's 2 grandparents, a first-time mom, and a little baby. And they're living in this war zone in terrible conditions. And because of the shelling and because of the severe food shortages and because of the danger of being out in the street in an area where that's controlled by one of the opposing factions, this family was unable to secure enough food for themselves, but more importantly, they were unable to secure any milk for the baby. In fact, in their most dire moments, all they had available to feed the baby was tea. And as you can imagine, the child was not thriving. The child was not growing. Things were not looking good. But then one day, to their surprise, they heard footsteps on the front porch of their house. And as they peeked through the window, they saw a man that they knew, somebody from in town, who was one of their Muslim neighbors, somebody who was part of the other faction in the war. It was a man named Fadil. This is a true story. You can read this in the New York Times archive. And Fadil happens to own a cow. And that day, Fadil came walking up with his big, heavy rubber work boots covered with mud. And he's carrying a half a liter of milk. And he brings it to the door for the baby, even though that family were Serbians and he was not. And they were shocked by Fadil's gesture. They were shocked by his generosity, but Fadil was not done. In fact, Fadil got in the habit of coming back every single day with a half a liter of milk, always delivering that half liter for the baby. And if you're interested in the hard numbers, Fadil came 442 days in a row, bringing that half liter of milk for the baby until the time when the baby and her mother finally had a window, a safe opportunity to cross the border into a place where it was safer for them to live. But the part of this story I haven't told you yet that makes it even more inspiring for me, the part of this story that makes it my favorite, is that Fadil brought this milk every day, walking through a gauntlet of ridicule and accusations from people that looked like him, who were accusing him of being a traitor. The New York Times reported that Fadil refused to accept any money for the milk. He just kept showing up every day with milk to care for that little girl. And there were other families on the street who began to insult him. They got in the habit of insulting him every day on the way to that house. And they would tell him, Fadil, you should give your milk to Muslims and you should let the Serbian children die. And Fadil never said a word, never answered their argument. He just kept walking with those big, heavy, muddy boots up to that Serbian house, carrying that half liter of milk for 442 days in a row. Persecuted because of righteousness, you say. There is a conflict between the values of Jesus and the values of the world. And it's always there, but in the midst of war, it becomes painfully apparent. It becomes obvious that the values of the world will say, you should let the children of your enemies die of starvation. And the values of Jesus say, you should love your neighbor the same way you love yourself. And sometimes when you try to live into those Jesus values, sometimes when you try to love your neighbor the way that you love yourself, sometimes the other neighbors in the neighborhood will turn on you for that. Sometimes the other neighbors around will turn on you, but Jesus says when that happens, when the other neighbors start to turn on you for doing something that's right, when that happens, you're blessed. You're blessed when they turn on you, because when you're persecuted for doing right, well, that's how you know that you're on the right track. When you do something that's so right that the wrong people start to get mad at you about it, Jesus says that's how you know. That's one of the indicators that will tell you that you're on the right track toward inheriting the kingdom of heaven. And if Jesus had simply concluded this Beatitudes passage right there at the end of verse 10, if Jesus had just stopped right there after saying, blessed are the persecuted, those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. If he had stopped right there, it would feel like a tidy bookend to the Beatitudes. It would feel like it was all wrapped up with a neat little bow around this entire passage. But in the next couple of verses, Jesus does something else that's unexpected. You see, most scholars would agree that the actual official Beatitudes ended right where we just left off at the end of verse 10. And all of the statements that we've been reading throughout this series, they all started and they all used language that spoke about people in the third person. I don't know if you remember your, middle school English, but what that means is it's talking about them over there. Blessed are those, blessed are they, blessed are them, blessed are those who are merciful. This was the language Jesus used in all of those blessings that we've read so far. But then in verse 11, Jesus switches his voice. He switches to a second person voice. He's not saying I, he's not saying them, he's saying you. He's talking directly to somebody. And this is the part where the introduction to the sermon has kind of come to a close. In fact, if you were to look at this printed in your Bible or on the Bible app on your phone, you might notice that all of the blessings we've read up to this point, they're printed with indentation to indicate that it's almost like lyric or poem or song. It's written, it's printed not in paragraph form. Verse 11 starts to be printed in paragraph form. This is when the meat of the sermon is beginning, and I have this suspicion, can't prove it, but I have this suspicion that while Jesus had been talking to all of the crowd, all of the people who had taken the day off of work or not had work to take a day off from, the people who had brought their sick and injured and disabled relatives or who themselves were sick, injured, and disabled, Jesus is talking to all of these people, but I have this suspicion that at verse 11, he changes his point of reference and he looks right at some of his disciples. These people who are brand new followers, these people who just got signed up. I mean, they're in their probationary stage, right? I think he looks at them and he says, blessed are you. Not blessed are they, not blessed are those, not blessed are them, blessed are you. When people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. He says. It's as if Jesus is saying, when somebody mistreats you, but not just any mistreatment, when they mistreat you because of the faith decisions that you've made. When somebody starts to abuse you, or neglect you, or persecute you because of the faith convictions that you hold. When somebody starts to ridicule you for the decision that you made to say yes when I called you to follow me, Jesus says, you're blessed. You are blessed. If somebody persecutes you because of me, because you're connected to me. And even as we read it, we can tell that this is different from all of the other blessings that came before. It's different than the other ones that we've studied. This blessing sounds ominous. It sounds disconcerting. It sounds kind of like a warning or a prediction about the future. And if you've spent any time reading further into the Gospel of Matthew or reading Mark or Luke or John, or for that matter, if you've read anything from the book of Acts or the rest of the New Testament, you probably have already picked up on the fact that there are insults and lies and persecution bearing down on the disciples at this point, right? If you've read any of the rest of the story, you know that they're going to experience some persecution. They're going to go through some hard times. You know all of this, but the disciples didn't know this. They had not read the Gospels yet. They hadn't written the Gospels yet. They hadn't read the book of Acts because they hadn't lived the book of Acts quite yet. When Jesus said this to them, they didn't know what was coming. When Jesus said this to them, the first disciples had just been invited to follow. I don't know how many days had passed yet between their call and this moment, but it wouldn't surprise me a bit if Peter and Andrew still have fish guts stains on their shoes. Like, it hasn't been long. They're still in their first 2 weeks. They're learning the ropes. They're trying to figure things out. They don't know where all this is going to go. They don't know where this is heading. They don't really know what Jesus is like. They've only been around him a little bit. They don't know what this is going to require of them. They don't know what this is going to mean for them. And here's Jesus, all but promising that the road ahead is going to be hard. It's going to be painful. And it makes you wonder if Peter and Andrew and the rest had any idea what they were signing up for. And you kind of have to question Jesus' salesmanship a little bit of this thing, right? I mean, he's not pitching this internship as something that sounds very awesome right here in this moment. Can you imagine if you went to a car dealer and you test drove a car and the guy that was riding along with you said, now every 3 trips that you ride in this car, after you go about 50 miles, you're probably going to need to see the chiropractor because the suspension in this thing is terrible. And by the way, the steering, we're not real confident that it's very responsive and we haven't checked the brakes. You know, like that's not the kind of car that you're hoping to go and test drive. And this is kind of what it sounds like when Jesus is pitching this discipleship life. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. And there's going to be moments when it's going to feel like something more than what you signed up for. You know, about 27 years ago, there was a nuclear power plant in Connecticut called the Millstone Nuclear Power Plant, which is an odd name if you have any kind of biblical, awareness. That just makes me laugh. But the Millstone Nuclear Power Plant in Connecticut, and they had a big problem. Their problem was that the management in the plant was intentionally ignoring proper safety protocols when it came to the handling and the disposal of used nuclear materials. Okay? The very short, simple version of that is that after so many months of generating power, you have to remove these uranium rods and you have to handle them in a certain way, and they have to be left to sit unused and cool down for so long, and then they have to be put into a vat of water, but only a certain number of rods at a time, or that water will boil and it'll produce steam that's radioactive and poisonous. And so the management of this plant was ignoring all of those rules because it's cheaper. It saves money if you don't have to shut down the whole unit long enough to do all of those steps. They were putting too many fuel rods into the cooling ponds at one time, and they were running a real risk of causing that water to boil and releasing radioactive steam into the environment. And the supervisors at the plant knew full well that they were breaking the rules, breaking the law, in fact, but they were saving so much money in the process that they turned a blind eye. But there was this conscientious senior nuclear engineer, a guy named George Galatas, and he was very concerned. George knew that the longer these risky operations were allowed to continue, the more danger it posed to human life inside and outside of the plant. He knew for months, he tried for months to convince his supervisors that they had to put an end to these dangerous, illegal practices, but they refused. And so George, who was a Christian, took it upon himself to start praying about what he should do, about what his responsibility should be. And he would take his lunch hour every day for weeks, and he would go and he would just try to be quiet and listen and pray and ask God what he should do. He asked God for guidance, and after a while, he felt convicted that it was his responsibility to report the plant's violations to the Nuclear Regulatory commission. Unfortunately, the commission was unable to offer George any kind of whistleblower protections, and so his reports became public knowledge. And when George went back to work, he feared for his safety. Feared for his safety because he had to face people who were angry at him for filing the reports that he had filed trying to save human life. And he had confrontations with some coworkers, and he was shunned by some other coworkers, and he faced intimidation and he faced harassment for 18 months before he was finally able to leave that job. Here was George Galatas trying to do the right thing. He's calling for the enforcement of crucial nuclear safety protocols. I mean, he is likely saving and prolonging life inside and outside of the plant by standing up for what's right, but his principled stand for doing what's right made him a target at work. His coworkers treated him like a traitor. And they were angry not only because he was putting their jobs and their company in jeopardy, but he was actually opening them up to the potential of criminal charges if they were found liable for what they'd been doing, and they were angry. And so they thought of him as a traitor. And he was just trying to do what he thought God wanted him to do. And the thing is that this is the kind of treatment that Jesus' disciples always seem to get. When Jesus' first generation of disciples didn't walk in lockstep with the Pharisees and their legalism, they were accused of blaspheming and turning their back on the faith of their people and the faith of their childhood. When they preached the name of Jesus with foreign languages that were only gifts of the Holy Spirit, they were instead accused of just being sloppy drunks. These first generation disciples of Jesus, they were arrested, they were imprisoned more often than we can possibly count. They were beaten, they were maimed, they were bruised, and ultimately many of them were killed because of their allegiance to Jesus. And they were never violent. They were never disrespectful. They lived in peace as they shared their faith. But there is a conflict between the values of the kingdom of heaven and the values of this world. There's a conflict between those two values, and a conflict between Jesus and human nature. And if you live your life like Jesus' first disciples lived their lives, then you're going to be peaceful. And you're going to be respectful, and you're not going to be forceful, and you're not going to be demanding, and you're not going to push your own way and push your own agenda. You're going to be self-differentiated. You're going to be non-anxious. You're going to be somebody who's gentle as a lamb, and yet you're still going to be misunderstood and maligned. It makes me think about those poor souls who tried to adopt Ralphie the French bulldog. Because you know that they walked into that SPCA shelter and they thought to themselves, oh, I bet all he needs is a little TLC. We'll make a warm bed for him down at the foot of our bed or by the fireplace, and we'll get some good toys and new bowls and a new collar, and we'll do all of the things that you do to make a new dog feel right at home. And we'll scratch his belly, and we'll tell him what a good boy he is. We'll take good care of him. We'll have him rehabilitated in no time. And then they got home with him, and that's not how things worked out. They did everything right. They did everything nice. They were peaceful. They were gentle. They scratched in the right places. They fed at the right times. They tried to do all of the right stuff. And then that dog was still Ralphie. He was angry and he was vicious, just like before, till they finally said, we've got to take him back. And Jesus knows that his disciples are going to feel some of that. They're going to feel like we're trying to do all the right things. We're trying to be peaceful. We're trying to be gentle. We're trying to be loving. We're trying to be kind to our communities. And yet this is how they respond. This is how they treat us. Jesus knows that the conflict between his values and the world's values is a severe conflict. It's a big gap. And Jesus knows that the road ahead is not going to be easy, but he does offer this piece of encouragement and this invitation in verse 12. He says, rejoice and be glad. And this is one of those moments, again, like we've already seen a number of times in these sermons, where all of the people listening are like, is he talking to us? Rejoice and be glad, Jesus says, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And for a student of the Old Testament, like most of these disciples were, this brings to mind so many images and stories of prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, people who kept speaking God's truth to a bunch of people who didn't want to hear it. And they were people, they were leaders, they were prophets who didn't give up. They didn't ever quit preaching the message because they had had a real encounter with God. They couldn't not talk about it. Isaiah had had a real encounter with God. You can read about it in Isaiah chapter 6. Ezekiel had had real visions of what's truly happening in the heavenly realms and in the cosmic world. Jeremiah had had a real encounter with God. They couldn't not talk about it. It was like it was shut up inside of them, begging to get out. And this is what Jesus is after. Jesus is after a devotion that doesn't give up in the face of persecution. Over the next few verses, you read through the rest of Matthew chapter 5, and you'll find Jesus refer to or compare his disciples to salt and light, which are both catalysts that make a noticeable impact in whatever environment that they get exposed to. And that's exactly why Jesus brings it up, because he's calling for his followers' righteous living to be catalytic. He's calling for righteousness to be life and environment changing, for our righteous living to make a difference. And your decision to live a righteous life, the decision that you make to actually obey Jesus, your decision to live a righteous life is not always going to make sense to the world and the neighbors and the friends and the family around you. It's not always going to make sense to them. In fact, there's going to be times when your decision to live a righteous life is offensive and disappointing to the people around you. Because your decision to live for Jesus is going to call you to love those that your community wants you to hate. Your decision to live for Jesus is going to challenge you to include people who are being excluded by everybody else. Your decision to live for Jesus is going to result in blessing people that appear to deserve cursing. Your decision to follow the inroads into the kingdom of heaven might result in you carrying a half liter of milk through a gauntlet of people telling you, don't go, let them starve. That might be what your journey with Jesus looks like. And there will be times when people who aren't living for Jesus won't understand, will not appreciate what you're doing, and it may cost you. And Jesus is saying when that happens, and it's going to happen, when there's one of those moments that the people around you don't get it, don't appreciate it, wish you would quit it, wish you'd go away, when that happens, don't give up. Don't change your mind. Don't lose your saltiness. Don't hide your light. Jesus is saying there's going to be a moment when your righteousness gets you in trouble. Don't give up, because your resilience when you're mistreated, your perseverance when you are abused, your stick-with-itness when you're persecuted, is going to allow you to experience something of God that you've never experienced any other time. Your resilience when you're mistreated and misunderstood and maligned is going to allow you to experience God's provision in a way that you didn't know was possible. And your reaction in the face of persecution is going to lead hearts around you to be changed. Your continuation, your perseverance in the face of persecution is going to change hearts around you. You know, after the Sermon on the Mount is completed in Matthew chapter 7, I just have to turn one more page in my Bible, And there's a moment in Matthew chapter 8 where Jesus and his disciples, these close followers, find themselves in a boat in the middle of the lake, a large lake, when a storm blows in. And all the winds are howling and the waves are crashing. And you've got to remember that most of these disciples grew up on the water. Many of them were commercial fishermen. And so by extension of that, they were familiar with boating. They were not people who were easily scared by the conditions out there. But in this particular moment, they were panicked, petrified, terrified. And Matthew says Jesus was sleeping in the boat. And the disciples are asking themselves, they're thinking to themselves and thinking to each other, can you believe this guy sleeping when we're all about to drown? That's not the original Greek, but it was something like that. And there was Jesus up in the front of the boat. I don't know how much time you spent around boats, but if you're in a big heavy storm and there's a lot of waves coming at you, they come right over the front of the boat. You know, it's hard for me to imagine Jesus being totally dry in this situation, but Matthew says Jesus was sleeping peacefully while the storm was raging all around him. And when the disciples finally decided, we better wake him up, they're panicked and he's not. They're terrified and he's not. They're anxious and he's unafraid. And you know why, right? It's because he's got a different perspective. It's because when the storm of life is blowing and when everything is tossing and turning to and fro, and when he's not sure how to feel, he's got a different perspective. And Matthew tells us that Jesus got up from the place where he was sleeping up in the boat, and he spoke to the wind and the waves, and everything became calm again. And then the disciples asked the same question, but with a completely different tone. They said, can you believe this guy? Can you believe this guy? I mean, he speaks to the wind and it stops. Can you believe this guy? He talks to waves and they obey. Can you believe this guy? That's an important question. In fact, I want to tell you that's the question that we've been wrestling together with all these 8 weeks. Can you believe this guy? Because throughout this series, we've heard Jesus make some very particular claims about the good life. We've heard Jesus make some very specific, particular statements about what a human life well lived looks like. And everything Jesus has said along our journey in this series has been counterintuitive. Jesus has invited his disciples to live lives that are marked and defined by justice, mercy, humility, hope, purity, righteousness, and peace. I mean, this is what we've been doing all of these weeks. Jesus is inviting us to be the kind of people who live under those characteristics with those as our goals. And despite your natural inclinations and despite your intuitions and despite your instincts, Jesus is saying, this is the way. This is the way to the good life. This is the way that gets you to where you ought to go, to where you need to go, to where you were made to go. And don't worry, because Jesus is not saying that you have to accomplish or travel this path on your own. Quite the opposite. Jesus wants to help you. Jesus wants to walk with you. Jesus wants to reinvent you. Jesus wants to carry you. All of these metaphors work, but Jesus wants to help. But the one thing you've got to do is choose which path you're going to travel. And the options are, you can go this way, which is the path that you blaze on your own. This is the path where you get to be in charge and you get to make the decisions and you get to go the direction and make the turns that make the most sense to your human spirit. This is the way that you get to go when you say, I'm going to decide when we go and how fast we go and when we stop and how long we stop. I'm going to be the one to be in charge because I know best what I like and what I want and what I need. That's one path. And then there's this other path. And as you're standing here looking down this path, it doesn't look like the path you want to go down. But here's Jesus saying, that's the way. I know who you are. I know what you were made to be. I know who you are called to be. I know what's best for you. And I'm telling you that's the way, and I'll help you. And this is the decision And the question is, can you believe this guy? Can you believe the guy who said, blessed are the poor in spirit? Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Can you believe this guy? I hope you do. I hope you do. Some of you may not, at least not yet. But if today's the day that you're ready to say, you know what, I've gone that way and it's not working. I've gone that direction. It hasn't worked well for me. If you're ready to make that change and say, I'm going to try believing this guy. Not only does he want to carry you and walk that journey with you, but we do too. We want to walk that journey together. So we want to help you. We'd love to see you in the hub. We'd love to talk to you. Any one of us that's wearing one of the How Can I Help lanyards that mine's somewhere backstage. We'd love to talk to you to make this journey together. But you're the only one who can decide. Do you believe this guy? We're going to do something together as we wrap up. The worship team has a brand new song to introduce for us today. Still? Y'all still doing that? Yeah. Okay, good. That would be ironic. Worship team's got a brand new song. It's one of my favorite songs that's come out in the last couple of years. And it uses a Hebrew word to refer to God. The word is Jireh. You're going to need to know what that means. This is the name that Abraham gave to God in the moment when God provided a sacrifice, a ram for a sacrifice, so that Abraham would not be called on to sacrifice his own son. And the word means, Jireh means, the Lord will provide. It means God is enough. It means that although you could go that direction where you try to chart your own course and make your own way and provide for yourself and figure out your own answers, it means that if you go this way, God is enough. Can you believe this guy? This guy that would go to such lengths, such great lengths, to even care about which decision you make. It's his breath in our lungs. It's him that closed the gap. And so as we wrap up this morning and we sing this beautiful song, we'll also participate in a meal. We do this every week to remind each other and to remind ourselves of the great extent to which God has gone to help us see the way, to invite us to the way. So we have these little pieces of cracker and these little cups of grape juice. They're nothing magical. It's bread and grape juice, just plain old stuff. In fact, we have kits for this in the back of the room. If you didn't grab one on your way in, just raise a hand. We have some ushers that'll bring them to you right at your seat. Like no big deal. We're used to this. But I want to tell you, we do this every week just so that we can remember that God looked down and knew that we didn't know which way to go, that we were lost, like sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus said, I'm going to go show them the way. I'm going down there to show them the way. Can you believe this guy? Let me pray for you. Father, I thank you for your love and your hospitality, your generosity, your sacrifice for us, because without you, we have no breath. We have no direction. We have no purpose. We have no meaning without you. God, we have heard these words of blessing, these Beatitudes that we've been studying all these weeks. We've heard these words, and the truth is that to our human ears, they make things sometimes sound backwards and upside down. And there are moments when it seems like, surely that's not how it really is. But here you are working on our hearts and asking us to believe you. Father, we want to believe. Help us in the moments when it's hard to believe. And start right now with this bread and this juice, that we might be tangibly touched and convicted by the love of Jesus Christ for us. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Call me out.
next time. You're dismissed.